All right, folks. So in this presentation, I'm going to outline some incredible adaptations that organisms on Earth exhibit and the process of natural selection that may answer how these adaptations may occur in nature. Here's a summary of what you're expected to know for this unit and this section. So if you'd like to pause and review, please do. Here are some key terms that I'm going to use throughout this presentation. So if you'd like to pause and summarize and include it in your science notebook, I encourage you to do so. So the main idea is that populations in an environment that are adapted to living conditions in that specific area are better able to meet their survival needs and are more likely to survive and reproduce offspring than those with key traits. So I guess you're going to say more likely to survive and reproduce offspring with those survival traits. So what I'm trying to say is that organisms in the environment do vary. You know, there are differences within traits. Those variations, some of them allow those organisms to survive and reproduce better. Those adaptations are passed on to the next generation. And then over many, many generations, you're going to see changes in populations over time. So that's kind of like there are adaptations and variations among organisms. They compete in nature, whether with themselves or predators. And the adaptations that are best suited to their environmental conditions are passed on more likely, and then over time they are selected by nature and populations change over time. So that's kind of the main idea of what I'm going to outline here. So first of all, an adaptation is any trait or behavior that helps an organism to survive and reproduce. So many include like color, such as the color of these bears. You know, there's some of them are their color is best suited to their environment, such as the polar bear or a grizzly bear for its particular environment. Camouflage, whether they blend into their environment or not. How they gather food, whether it's beaks and claws. Sensory abilities, any enhanced ability to see or to hear or to touch or taste or anything like that that enhances an organism's ability to survive. And then there's also behaviors that enhance an organism's ability to survive. Here are some examples of camouflage. I mean, look how well adapted this organism is to its environment. It's, well hidden and difficult for predators to find them. Food gathering adaptations. Birds are very amazingly adapted to different types of foods that they eat. And also their claws are well adapted to their habitats as well, whether they're climbing or catching prey or swimming. So sensory abilities, I mean, there are organisms like an eagle has extraordinary sight. Chameleons, octopuses, these all have incredible sensory abilities that enable them to have a better chance of surviving and reproducing, and are all considered adaptations. And then there's, of course, there's behaviors. Some organisms migrate to enhance their ability to survive and reproduce, and many organisms also hibernate in the wintertime to conserve energy in order to enhance their ability to survive and reproduce. So here's some examples of some amazing adaptations, like an anglerfish, to lure prey, or behaviors how they feed their young, and just incredible colorations and camouflage. Some just incredible adaptations. It's just extraordinary what nature is out there, and it's just so fun to learn about adaptations. There's just so many out there. It's incredible to learn about. So really what I'm getting at is like how do these adaptations arise? And scientists certainly theorize about it and study it. So we're going to talk about that today. First of all, organisms do differ in many of their traits. We differ in our traits. This picture down here just shows some of the traits that human beings, some silly traits that human beings have that are different, whether it's your earlobes or the way your thumb bends or how your toes are, or, the hair on your knuckles. These are just little traits that human beings differ in, but traits are genetic differences that occur in a species. And these traits are ultimately going to determine what is passed on to the next generation if it enhances your survival or not. Um, so here's the question we're really getting at is how do those adaptations arise and how do they change over time? How could they possibly change over time? And there are theories about how this possibly occurs. So one is a theory of natural selection. It's a process that explains how the survival of organisms shows how a species can change over generations of time. So that's kind of what the rest of this presentation is going to be about, is this process of natural selection. Like, how could these adaptations actually arise in nature? So here's a really simplified example. Let's say we have a variety of different colored beetles. They have different traits. Some are green, some are brown. The the predator seems to prefer the green beetles, so it's going to more likely eat the green beetles. And then, a generation later, you could see that there's less green beetles because they're being eaten by the predator, and the brown population is increasing. And then over many generations, you have, you know, a different population of beetles. So that is a simplified version of the process of natural selection. This predator is selecting the green beetles. They're less likely to survive and reproduce. The brown beetles are more likely to pass on their traits to the next generation. And over many generations, you will see changes in populations, and that is called natural selection. So some factors that influence natural selection are overproduction. Most species produce far more offspring than could possibly survive. In many species, so many offspring are produced that there's not enough resources, food, water, living space for all of them. So more offspring that can possibly survive. So the fact that not every, offspring will survive is a factor that influences natural selection. A very important factor is variation. Members of a species differ from one another. Just like human beings, there are many different traits that human beings and all organisms or most organisms possess that's either going to enhance their survival or hinder their survival. And in many times, a lot of traits are kind of neutral and don't really benefit or harm an organism's possibility for survival. And then within that, because of variation, there's competition and predators that are going to allow certain variations to be passed on more likely, or certain variations that are going to be wiped out and not passed on to the next generation. So, habitats, resources are limited. You have predators, and you're competing for survival, and some traits are going to enhance your survival. So, make sure you know that these three factors are influencing natural selection in nature. So let me kind of outline that a little bit more simply. First of all, there is variation among species among organisms. Let's say you have butterflies of two different colors. There's a variety of colored butterflies. They are going to compete or try to survive in an environment where they're competing for habitats and resources. So not all of them are going to survive. The adaptations that are best suited for survival, like in this case, it looks like the brown ones kind of have an advantage. Like the birds aren't able to find them as easily. So if you're this color right here, you're less likely to pass on those traits, and your adaptations are not allowing you to survive and reproduce as well as the brown ones. So what's going to happen is these guys are going to be more likely to survive and reproduce and more likely to pass on those traits to the next generation. And what happens is that you have changes in populations over time. And this picture showing you that the brown population seems to be increasing because the predators aren't able to find them. So this outlines not only the factors that influence natural selection, but also the process of natural selection. So a very important factor in the process of natural selection is variations. There are, differences among members of the same species, and that's so important. It's so important because I mean, for example, all these human beings, we all have variations in the human race. And some of these traits, depending on the environment, are going to enhance their survival and likelihood of passing on those traits to the next generation. And some very well may not have behavior or physical adaptations that enable them to pass on those traits to the next generation. Um, so variations is a critical component of natural selection. If all human beings and all organisms were identical and there was a change in the environment, then they would all be gone. So variation is an essential element to the survival of the species. Charles Darwin, the one who kind of like first discovered some of these ideas, um, first observed, bird beaks. He noticed that different islands on the Galapagos Island, the finches all had beaks that were well adapted to their particular food source. So that's kind of what got a little bit Darwin started on this idea, is that he knew that these birds were all finches and most likely came from a common ancestor, but he was very curious about how they were so well adapted to their particular island and their particular food sources. That got him, theorizing about the process of how that might occur. So some of them had, larger beaks to get into, large seeds that were available on that island, whereas, other birds had smaller beaks that were able to get into, the bark of trees and get, smaller seeds that were available on their particular island. So, um, variations do exist among populations. Here's examples, some snails. Let's say a predator came along. Are there some snails that have variations that are going to, um, not enhance their survival? Maybe the predator can see the yellow ones better, so it picks the yellow ones off, and it won't be as likely to pass on its traits. Whereas maybe the darker colored one is more difficult for the predator to see and is more likely to pass on its traits. And this really is dependent on the environment. The environment is really determining what traits are, um, have an advantage or not. And then, as we know in Earth's history, the environment changes, so then therefore the adaptations would eventually change over generations of time. So next is, some variations are favorable. So, that again depends on the particular environment. I can't emphasize this enough. Like, the environment matters. So in this particular case, maybe the brown one has a favorable trait, which means this one is more likely to survive and pass on its traits to the next generation, where the white one doesn't blend in as much. Therefore, it's found by a predator more easily and less likely to pass on these white traits to the next generation. The ones that do survive tend to have more favorable traits. So, they tend to have more favorable traits, the ones that do survive. So in this case, it looks like we have a predator here. We got a variety of different colored rabbits. We got dark brown, gray, light brown rabbits. And, it looks like possibly, the light brown rabbits may have an advantage, and it's more likely that they will survive and pass on this color to the next generation. What you'll see is, over generations of time, changes in the population of rabbits. And the gray ones might have the greatest disadvantage because the predator can easily find them, and they're less likely to pass on those traits to the next generation. So what we see is, with this process of natural selection, is that populations change over time. And it's very important that you understand that this occurs over generations of time. All right, this does not occur in the lifetime of any organism. Okay, what we have is a variety of snails, and then depending on the predators in the environment, some snails have a better chance of surviving and reproducing. In this case, it looks like the brown ones are more likely to survive and reproduce in this scenario, and the white ones are less likely to. And that what we have is, over generations of time, changes. So what has happened here is that this snail population, over generations of time, the variety of snails, certain traits are more likely to survive and pass on and are selected naturally by the environment. And then those traits are passed on, and over many generations, you will see changes in populations. So really what I'm saying is that any change is evolution. And I know that's a scary word, but let's just use these simple examples to kind of outline why it's not so scary. But any change over time is evolution, whether it's technology or organisms. So in this case, it looks like the darker colored beetles have an advantage in this particular environment. So they're a little bit more camouflage, and the white beetles seem to have a disadvantage. So the predator seems to prefer or is able to easily find the white beetles, so they're less likely to pass on those traits. The darker ones are more likely to pass on their traits to the next generation, and over generations, you see that the white beetles are kind of being wiped out, and the darker beetles are able to reproduce more and pass on those traits to generations. And then what we see is that, over time, this population has become darker colored, and that is evolution. And we see this occur in nature. We see that whether it's predators or environmental conditions select certain adaptations that are best suited to their environment, and we see populations change over time. So this beetle population has evolved over generations of time. No organism evolves in its lifetime. So it's the traits that are passed on to the next generation. You will see over generations of time, populations change or evolve. Here's another example of a predator-prey. It seems like these brown mice here kind of have a disadvantage. They don't camouflage as well, and the darker mice might have an advantage. So what's happening is the brown mice are being picked off by a predator. They're less likely to pass on those brown traits. The darker mice are more likely to pass on those traits to the next generation. And what we see is over generations of time, populations change. Like this is just in a matter of a few generations, but you can see this population is darker colored compared to the original population. And that's an example of evolution. Any change over time is evolution. Another extraordinary example is the story of the peppered moth. So this occurred in Europe. Basically, pollution became so extreme that the trees became darker colored. So due to pollution, these trees became darker colored. And you can see that, in this case here, that, the darker colored moth has an advantage here. So first of all, the trees were originally white colored. And you can see that the white moth is well camouflaged here. It was well adapted to its environment. There was a variety of moths. There were darker colored, lighter colored moths. And pollution turned the trees dark. The trees became darker in color. And then what happened is that the darker population of moths increased over time, and the whiter population decreased over time. And then what makes the story even more remarkable is that laws were passed where they weren't allowed to pollute the environment as much. And what happened is the darker moth population decreased, and the light colored moth population again began to increase. So really what this shows is that natural selection really is driven by the environment. There's no, better adaptations than others. It's really determined by the environment. If the trees are dark colored, then dark colored moth population will increase because it has a better chance to survive and pass on those traits. And then if the trees are, lighter colored, then a lighter colored moth would have an advantage. And that's how we see organisms change over generations of time. So here, this picture outlines not only the factors of natural selection, but kind of re-emphasizes some of the points that we've been discussing. So first of all, there's, a variety, overproduction. Not all of these guys are going to survive. There is a variety among the populations, darker colored and light colored. Competition and predators and other environmental factors will determine which traits are less likely to survive and reproduce. So in this case, it looks like the lighter colored has a disadvantage and the darker colored has more of an advantage. So over time, the population will become darker. And that's because of the environmental factors, in this case, predators. And that's a change over time. So very important is there are many misconceptions about what natural selection is, and I just want to outline that really quick. Natural selection does not involve organisms trying to adapt in order to survive. It's not something that you try to do. These are traits that are inherited, and you can't try to create adaptations that natural selection does not involve trying. Evolution is not progress, because what happens is if the environment changes, then the traits or adaptations that are selected for ultimately change. So it is not a ladder. There's no progress. It's just organisms best suited to their particular environment. And what we know about Earth is that the environment is constantly changing. So therefore, the organisms have the ability to change. Organisms are not always getting better. If you're best suited to your environment and then all of a sudden the environment changes, all of a sudden different variations and different traits will be selected for. So it is not progress and is not always about getting better. Evolution is not changed by chance. There are environmental factors that determine which traits are passed on or not. So it is not, evolution is not by chance at all. Natural selection is all about the big and strong dominating the small and weak. No, in many environments, small and weak is a great advantage. Dinosaurs, were not well adapted to, the environmental conditions in the Cenozoic era. So, no, it is not about the big and strong dominating small and weak. There are many examples of small and weak or, certain traits that are best suited to their environment, really. Evolution is about blending different organisms to produce new forms. No, not exactly. First of all, species of organisms are, only able to produce offspring within their own, species. So I'm not even sure what this misconception is exactly, but evolution is not about blending different organisms to produce new forms. By definition, species can only reproduce with one another. And this one right here, okay, don't be this person, don't be that person right there, because it takes generations of time. Organisms do not evolve in their lifetime. Nope. Some of us will survive and pass on our traits to our offspring, and some of us won't, and that's due to environmental conditions and our adaptations and what's selected for in our environment. So these are all not true for natural selection, none of those. So in conclusion, adaptations are a trait or behavior that helps an organism survive and reproduce. This presentation, we outlined how these adaptations can actually occur, and that is by the process of natural selection. This explains how species can change over generations of time, and that occurs because there are variations among populations. They do compete and are exposed to predators, and some of them sadly die. Adaptations that do enhance your ability to survive are more likely, reproduced for the next generation. And then what happens is you see changes in populations occur over generations of time. And that is called evolution. I hope this was helpful, and thanks for listening.